Hey, Soul Stories fam. We're starting a new love journey. Tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family. Now stay with us. The story begins. Christmas Eve settled over Snowfall Ridge, with a cold sharp enough to cut into skin, and the snow, like white notes falling endlessly from a fog-soaked sky, covered the road leading to the small wooden house at the edge of town, where the warm yellow glow of the kitchen lights was still trying its best to fight off the winter creeping closer. Inside, Eli Mercer, the man who once had a gentle smile and warm hands but now carried only a quiet heaviness and eyes that stayed glued to the floor, was stirring a simple pot of soup, the dish he always made for Hannah whenever the wind changed, because it was the closest thing to comfort he could still offer his daughter after 2 years of loss. Hannah sat on the rug beside the tiny Christmas tree the two of them had decorated themselves, her little hands carefully sticking snowflake stickers onto the red stocking hanging by the fireplace. She sang the Christmas songs she learned at school in her bright, sweet voice, glancing toward the door every few moments, as if this Christmas were bringing something far bigger than their small home could hold. "Daddy," Hannah whispered, straightening the stocking, "she's really coming, right?" Eli tightened his grip on the spoon and looked up at her. "Maybe," he said, keeping his tone even, though an unnamed worry lurked beneath it, because outside the snow was falling harder, like a warning that people who were weak, exhausted, or worn thin rarely made it through the road into town if the bus isn't stuck in the snow. That simple sentence was enough to make the little hand holding the stocking freeze. Hannah set it down, stood up, and walked to the window, pressing her face to the icy glass. "I hope she likes Christmas," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Eli wanted to tell her that the woman coming here didn't have to like Christmas, because she was coming under a contract called the Live-In Family Assistant Agreement, a kind of arrangement he had signed only because he had no other way to balance work and being a father. But when he looked at his daughter's small shoulders trembling ever so slightly, he couldn't bring himself to crush the fragile hope she held. 8:17 p.m. 2 hours late. Eli exhaled and stepped forward, intending to pull the curtains closed so Hannah wouldn't keep hoping when. Knock, knock, knock. 3 soft taps. Not firm, not hurried. More like the knock of someone who had used up their very last bit of courage to touch a door they weren't sure would open for them. Hannah whirled around, her eyes lighting up like tiny lamps. "Daddy, I told you, she's here!" Eli walked to the door with a heart beating harder than he wished. He placed his hand on the latch, pausing for a brief moment as if he needed one more breath to face something he had never been ready for. Then he opened the door. A blade-sharp gust of wind rushed in. Snow whipped across the floor like scattered scraps of paper, and standing in the middle of that snow was Margaret Hayes. She stood upright, though her shoulders trembled every time the wind struck. Her charcoal coat was frayed at the edges, with a few spots that looked hand-stitched, and her old rolling suitcase had only one working wheel, the remaining straps stretched almost to the point of snapping. Her canvas shoes were wet, revealing thin socks trembling with each step. Her long hair, tied in a low ponytail, was streaked with snowflakes clinging to the strands like fragile outlines of someone who had endured too many hard days back to back. Her face was pale, but her eyes, those deep black eyes, held something different, a quiet, beautiful composure, as if poverty could touch her clothes but had never managed to wear down her dignity. "Mr. Mercer," she asked, her voice small yet clear, carrying a question, a hope, and a fear of being turned away from the only house that could save her from the cold outside. Eli said nothing for a few long seconds stretched tight between them. She was poor, far poorer than anything he had imagined. Looking at her meant looking straight into a story that had been neither gentle nor kind. And then Hannah shattered the icy silence by running forward, tiny, warm, and full of spark. "Miss, come in, come in. It's really cold out there." Margaret flinched at the sudden warmth, as if the child had touched a part of her that had been frozen for far too long. "Hannah," Eli called softly, reaching to pull her back, but too late. Hannah had already grabbed Margaret's hand, her small palm so warm it made Margaret's breath hitch. Eli watched the scene, one small hand holding a hand hardened by life, and in that moment something softened inside him. something he had believed his closed-off heart had buried under the thick snow of 2 years of grief. "Come in," Eli finally said, and though he tried to sound firm, his voice still betrayed a rare hesitation. Margaret stepped over the threshold, and the snow clinging to her coat melted into droplets that splashed onto the floor like traces of the long journey she had endured to stand here, in this house, before this man. She bowed her head slightly as the warmth touched her skin. "Thank you for opening the door," she said. Simple words, yet they felt like a sigh released from deep within her chest. The house changed the moment she entered. The air felt lighter, the atmosphere softer, as if her presence, brushed against corners Eli had forgotten, needed light. Hannah tugged her hand, chattering excitedly. "Look, this is the little tree Daddy and I made. Do you like it?" Margaret nodded, her smile delicate and so beautiful that Eli had to turn away to hide the sudden emotion rising in him. "It's lovely," she whispered. "I can't remember the last time I saw Christmas the right way." Eli's eyes twitched. There was too much behind that sentence, too much pain he could see but didn't dare touch. Not tonight, and not when he still feared he wasn't strong enough to take on the story of a stranger. "You should rest," Eli said quietly, keeping the distance he believed he needed. "We'll go over the agreement tomorrow." Margaret nodded, as if simply having a warm room to sleep in was already a privilege. "Yes, I truly appreciate it." Hannah pulled her away, still talking nonstop. Eli stayed where he was, resting a hand on the doorframe, watching their two silhouettes fade down the small hallway toward the guest room. And he knew, from the moment she stepped through that door, something in this once silent house had begun to move. Not loudly, not clearly, but enough for his heart, for the first time in 2 years, to feel that winter might not last forever. Margaret couldn't remember how many times she had stood inside unfamiliar rooms, quietly observing them as if trying to read a book whose first chapter had been torn out. Yet when she stepped into the living room of Eli Mercer's house, she felt something entirely different. Not strangeness, but absence. A hollow space shaped like someone who had once lived, laughed, and breathed here. Someone whose presence lingered only in forgotten objects and tiny details left untouched, as though their owner might step out from a corner at any moment. The house wasn't messy, it was simply missing a heartbeat. On the mantel, a wedding photo was placed face down, as if someone couldn't bear to look at it, but also couldn't bring themselves to put it away. The small Christmas tree was beautiful, but only half decorated. Father and daughter must have gotten halfway through before something made Eli stop. In the corner, an old armchair sat with a neatly folded knit blanket, its cushion marked with the faint dip of someone who once sat there for hours seeking warmth from something that was no longer here. The space wasn't cold because of the temperature. It was cold because a soul had left, and those who remained did not yet know how to live without it. Hannah tugged Margaret's hand, her lively voice slicing through the quiet haze. "Look, this is my play corner. Daddy says I can keep it here because Mama wanted the living room to always have laughter in it." Margaret bent down to take in the simple toys, a few stuffed animals whose fur had turned fuzzy, half a box of missing Legos, and a coloring book left unfinished. "It's lovely," she said, lifting a slightly shabby but well-loved teddy bear. "You take such good care of your things." Hannah beamed, her eyes curving like small moons. "Mama said toys get sad if I don't look after them." The innocent remark tightened something inside Margaret's chest, just a little, like an invisible string pulled taut, enough to remind her that in this house, love had once been so fierce it left traces in every object. Eli stood near the doorway, arms folded across his chest, his face carved in the stillness of granite. Not cold, just distant, as if he needed the boundary between him and her to remain unmistakably clear, for both their sakes. "Do you need anything else?" he asked, voice low but cautious. Margaret shook her head. "No, thank you. Truly, this is more than enough." It wasn't a polite answer. For someone who had slept in a bus station waiting room for 3 nights straight, a real bed bordered on luxury. Her gaze drifted around the room and caught on a porcelain mug placed beside the coffee machine. The handle was chipped, but someone had carefully glued it back together with clear adhesive. A thin crack ran down the side, like a tiny scar only someone familiar would notice. She reached out and brushed her fingers lightly along the rim and immediately heard a sharp intake of breath behind her. Eli. He moved toward her quickly, almost instinctively. Don't, don't touch that. His voice wasn't angry. It sounded like something inside him had tightened too fast, too suddenly. Margaret pulled her hand back at once. I'm sorry, I didn't know. It's fine. Eli turned away, his jaw clenching. It belonged to Sarah. His former wife's name needed no explanation. It settled into the air, soft but cutting, like the snowflakes drifting outside. Beautiful, cold, and a reminder that some wounds ache the moment you brush against them. Margaret lowered her gaze. I understand. And she did. Some losses never disappear. They simply lie quiet in a corner of your heart, waiting for the slightest touch to ache again. Dinner that evening unfolded in a fragile silence. The kind where even setting a spoon down too firmly felt like it might crack the thin layer of composure everyone was struggling to hold. Margaret ate slowly, tasting the faint scent of chicken, the sweetness of basil, the warm undertone of burning wood from the fireplace, the sorts of things that remind a person they are still alive. Eli hardly looked at her, offering only a few basic questions about her trip before lapsing back into silence. Hannah spoke the most, chattering about school, about the paper reindeer she had hung up in class, about her dream of having a family with more people in it. When dinner ended, Hannah slipped her small hand into Margaret's and asked, her voice soft as ribbon, Miss Margaret, will you tell me a story? Eli stiffened. Hannah, let her rest. It's okay. Margaret offered a gentle, slightly trembling smile. I'd love to read to you. She followed Hannah to her room. Eli stayed at the doorway, neither stepping inside nor walking away. Margaret sat on the bed and opened a worn-out fairy tale book. As she read, her voice low and warm, like a winter night lit by fire, Hannah nestled against her shoulder, her eyelids fluttering shut. After a few minutes, Margaret began telling stories from memory instead of the book. Little tales she used to share with students who were afraid of the dark. And then, Hannah laughed. A bright, bell-like sound, as clear as a silver chime shaken awake after months of gathering dust. Eli stood in the doorway, and he froze. It had been so long, far too long, since he had heard his daughter laugh like that. The sound softened his eyes, and something heavy settled in his chest, as if someone had pressed a tender, painful memory right against his heart. He turned away before anyone could see the crack in his composure. Margaret looked up, catching his silhouette framed in the warm light. He stood there quiet, one hand braced against the doorframe, as if holding on to something fragile. She didn't say a word. She simply rested her hand on Hannah's back, patting lightly in a comforting rhythm. That night, just before the lamp was turned off, Hannah whispered, Miss Margaret, you smell like home. And Margaret spent a few seconds fighting back tears. The first morning in Snowfall Ridge opened with a kind of light so soft it felt almost shy. The kind of light that slipped through a frost-covered window, as if someone had gently lifted a thin winter curtain just enough to let the gentlest cold kiss the cheek of a waking soul. Margaret woke to the faint clatter of a pan on the stove. A simple sound, yet one that startled her with the realization that she hadn't heard anything this ordinary in months. Not the hurried noise of an apartment building, not the groan of wind seeping through the bus station glass at night, but the sound of a house that was alive. She sat up slowly, her shoulders aching as if carrying the remnants of the three-state journey, shivering lightly from the cold while breathing out a long exhale, as though she were returning a bit of worry to the air, worry that had clung to her far too long. The small living room where she slept wasn't pretty. The furniture was old, the blanket a little rough. But for someone who had curled up on hard plastic seats at night bus stations, this place held the feeling of a luxury she no longer believed she deserved. Safety. When she stepped into the hallway, the smell of coffee reached her first, followed by the clink of a spoon against a mug, and finally, a little brown curly-haired angel smiling from her booster seat, legs swinging as if gently kicking the morning awake. Miss Margaret, Hannah chirped, her eyes shining like two gemstones polished under sunlight. I waited for you to wake up so we could make breakfast together. Daddy makes eggs, but Daddy's eggs are sometimes salty and sometimes not salty. Eli glanced sideways, not arguing, but letting the corner of his mouth lift. So subtle that if Margaret hadn't been looking, she would have missed it. Breakfast is fine, he muttered, turning away again, still keeping his distance like a man retreating into the shadow of himself to avoid the light bright enough to reveal the part of his heart that had once been torn open. Margaret smiled at Hannah, feeling the small, warm hand pulling hers, a sweetness almost too gentle to believe. So what do you want to make? Scrambled eggs or peanut butter toast? I want both, the girl declared, raising her spoon like she was proclaiming an unbreakable Christmas law. And so, in the small pine-scented kitchen, an image strange yet breathtaking unfolded. Margaret, with her long hair still a little tangled from a night of restless sleep, leaning down beside Hannah, guiding the little hand to stir the eggs in small circles, while the morning light fell across her shoulders, softening the stitch patches on her sweater into tender lines of a story still unfolding. Eli stood behind them, not stepping forward, not interrupting. Like a man who wanted to look closely but was afraid that if he looked too long, he would see something he shouldn't understand, shouldn't feel, shouldn't let himself want. No one said it aloud, but the way he leaned against the counter, with arms crossed but eyes unable to leave the scene, revealed far more than the words he refused to speak. Hannah laughed out loud when she stirred too hard, and the eggs splattered onto the counter. Margaret laughed too, a sound so soft it felt torn from the heavy past she carried, falling into the kitchen like something warm in a place that had lacked laughter for far too long. And Eli, though he tried to hide it, paused for a heartbeat. A man who has lived with loss never forgets the sound that tightens his heart, the laughter of a child who has spent too many nights crying alone. After breakfast, when Hannah ran off to grab her backpack, the kitchen became strangely quiet. Not awkward, but brightened by something fragile, something that made both adults unsure whether to take a step forward or step back. Margaret stood by the sink, hesitating to help. Let me... I've got it, Eli said, too quickly, too tightly, like a reflex built from self-defense. She didn't argue, didn't push, didn't try to please. She simply withdrew her hands in that quiet acceptance, free of pride, free of resentment, made Eli more uncomfortable than any argument he'd seen before. She did not fight back, did not insist, did not try to earn approval. She just stood there with a kind of sad composure that tilted the air, as if the whole house was brushing against a shadow neither of them wished to open. In the end, Eli was the one who broke the silence. Margaret, he said, slow and careful, I want to know why you chose this program. Why come here with your circumstances? The last line slipped out thoughtlessly, truthfully, enough to hit them both in a tender spot. Margaret looked down at her hands, touching the tiny thread at her sleeve, the kind of extra stitch people make when they mend their clothes because they have no better option. Then she looked up, eyes neither avoiding nor hiding. My father passed away last year, she began, her voice even and slow, as if each word were lifted from the darkest corners. He left behind credit card debt, medical bills, unpaid utilities, too many things a low-paid teacher like me couldn't cover if I tried to keep the house. Eli said nothing, but his shoulders stiffened. I sold everything I could, Margaret continued. Furniture, my old car, a few pieces of my mother's jewelry, the only sentimental things I had left. A faint smile crossed her lips, the kind of smile worn by someone long familiar with losing things. After paying the debts, I didn't have a home to go back to. Eli swallowed slowly enough that she could see the movement in his throat. I lost my job too, she said, her voice dipping. Schools don't hire people without a stable address. I didn't have anything tying me to the city anymore. She turned slightly, looking out the window where snow fell thick like layers of memories stacking over one another. I chose the single-parent assistance program because it gave me one last chance. A temporary shelter, a job, a new starting point. She turned back to him. I didn't come here to be a burden. I'm just trying to keep going. A simple sentence, but it held a whole year of loss. Nights sleeping on hard seats, debt notices she never caused, a free fall no one had caught her from. Eli felt the small kitchen tighten around him. He wanted to say she didn't deserve any of it, wanted to say she was stronger than he had assumed, wanted to say he had been wrong to judge her for her snow-soaked shoes or her battered suitcase. But instead, what came out of his mouth was a sentence as cold as a December gust. "I'm not promising anything beyond the job you signed for." A tiny crack appeared in Margaret's eyes. Not hurt, not indignation, just acceptance. "That's fine," she said softly, her voice so calm it hurt more than anger ever could. "I'm not expecting anything else." And she smiled, small, thin, a smile that made his heart ache in a way he couldn't explain. She turned away just as Hannah came running with her backpack, so she didn't see Eli's eyes filled with things he didn't allow himself to feel, yet couldn't erase. Margaret opened the door, taking Hannah's hand. Two figures, one small, one slender, stepped into the white snow, leaving behind a kitchen where a man stood frozen, fingers tightening on the edge of the sink. And for the first time he realized, the coldest sentence spoken that morning wasn't for her, but for himself, the man who feared beginning again. That afternoon, the Mercer kitchen was filled with the soft, pale gold of a winter sun, the kind of light too weak to melt the snow on the porch, but gentle enough to make the house look a little less lonely than usual. Hannah sat cross-legged on the chair, a short wooden spoon in hand, her eyes glued to every movement Margaret made as though she were witnessing a secret ritual meant only for women to understand. Margaret opened the jar of flour with careful, practiced hands, hands that seemed made for tenderness and patience, the type of hands belonging to someone who had known loss deeply enough to treat every small task with her whole heart. "Stir gently in a circle." "That's it," she murmured, her voice so soft even the sunlight felt like it paused to listen. Hannah followed exactly as instructed. Then I stirred harder, and harder, until flour burst across her face like snowfall. Hannah froze for a heartbeat. Margaret held her breath. Then, the girl let out a laugh. A bright, ringing laugh, delicate and sparkling like tiny glass bells chiming inside a little church on a Sunday morning. Margaret laughed too, unable to stop herself, reaching over to swipe a bit of flour from Hannah's nose. And in that moment, something in the kitchen, something that had gone quiet long ago, flickered back to life. Eli stood at the threshold. He didn't walk in. He didn't speak, but he stood there like a man staring at something he didn't dare believe he was seeing. Hannah, his daughter, was laughing. Not laughing politely, not laughing to cheer him up. Not laughing because she missed her mother and didn't want him to hurt her more. She was laughing for real, laughing like a child, laughing fully, laughing the way a small heart blooms naturally when it feels safe. Eli exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding for far too long. He turned away before the softness in his eyes could betray him, as if afraid that if anyone witnessed that one fragile second, the 2 years he'd spent surviving might crumble in his hands. While the waffles cooked and the sweet scent of butter and vanilla drifted through the house, Margaret quietly began gathering the old cereal boxes from the shelf. Not because she thought she had the right to, but because she couldn't bear seeing the home so stripped of warmth. Hannah reached under the table and pulled out a photo box, holding it up for Margaret. "Do you want to see Mama? This is my Mama." Margaret sat beside her and took the worn wooden box. The faded photographs slipped out like pieces of a long-lost memory drifting back. Sarah, with soft blonde hair, eyes that knew how to smile, a deep blue dress in her wedding photo, her face radiant as she held baby Hannah when she was only 1. Margaret brushed her fingers along the edge of a photo, her touch reverent, as if handling something sacred. "She was very beautiful," she whispered. "She was," Eli replied from the doorway, making Margaret jump. She hadn't realized he was still there. "Sarah always looked beautiful, no matter what." His voice didn't shake, but there was something in its tone that lowered the entire room a beat. Margaret looked at the photo, then at Hannah. "You have her eyes," she said softly. Hannah grinned with all the innocence in the world. Eli stayed silent. The words had touched a place inside him he had been unable to reach for 2 years. Margaret carefully put the photos back into the box. Then, without fully knowing why, she did something even she couldn't quite explain. She made a small corner on the kitchen shelf, setting out a few photos of Sarah, one of Hannah's scribbly drawings, and the tiny Christmas tree Hannah had made at school. She gathered them like fragile pieces of a soul that once lived here, arranging them into a corner of memory, a place where anyone who walked in would feel that someone had once loved this house fiercely. When Eli returned from the garage, he stopped cold at the doorway. The corner, once bare and cold, now looked like a place where old pieces of life had been set gently, not to reopen the wound, but to remember it with gratitude. He said nothing, but his lips pressed together, as though he were swallowing something old yet still alive. That afternoon, Margaret took the laundry out to hang behind the house. The cold wind reddened her hands, but she smiled faintly as she watched Hannah run through the snow, trying to shape it into a tiny snowman. A woman's voice called from the fence next door. "You're the new girl, aren't you?" Margaret turned to see a woman in her 40s, sharp-eyed, her smile not entirely warm. "So, you're staying at the Mercers? Eating their food and sleeping under their roof?" The words fell like winter steel. Margaret didn't flinch. She had heard worse. At the bus station, in her old apartment, in the place she once worked, she simply smiled, a polite, impossible-to-fight smile. "I'm here to work, and I know I'll try my best to be worthy of that." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly disappointed that she hadn't provoked a reaction, then walked away. Margaret turned back to the laundry. Her shoulders didn't tremble. Inside the house, Eli stood behind the window, having seen the entire exchange. He was used to watching the women in his life face this town with quiet softness. He had never seen anyone face it with Margaret's silent strength. No anger, no wounded pride, no flattery, no apologies. Just standing straight, as if she had lived long enough to know that other people's words no longer had the power to break her. And for the first time, Eli realized he might have misjudged her. That night, after reading Hannah her bedtime story, Margaret stepped out of the little girl's room, gently closing the door behind her. Eli sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a coffee mug he wasn't drinking. Hannah peeked out from under her blanket, calling softly through the crack of the door. "Daddy?" He walked in. She reached her hand out. He took it. "Daddy, I like Miss Margaret." Her small, honest voice struck at the walls he had built carefully around himself, opening a tiny, frightening crack. "She makes our house warmer." Eli looked at his daughter, her face so much like her mother's it sometimes hurt, and all he managed was a quiet breath. No agreement, not denial, just silence. Because sometimes silence is the only truth an adult has the courage to offer. Hannah curled back into her blanket, eyes still open. "Daddy, will Miss Margaret stay for a long time?" Eli looked at the child he loved more than anything on earth, and because he couldn't lie to her, he leaned down, kissed her forehead, and said only, "Sleep, sweetheart." Then he stepped out of the room, leaning against the hallway wall, eyes closed in the dark. On one side of him was old grief. On the other hand, there was new warmth, and he stood caught in the space between the two. The morning the snow stopped falling, the cold still wrapped around the town like a stiff silver scarf that winter refused to loosen. Eli drove his old Ford to Maddie's Market to pick up a few essentials. Flour, coffee, some things for Hannah, and a bit of engine oil he had forgotten to buy the week before. Routine errands he had done hundreds of times, yet today they felt different, as if he were trying to keep everything exactly as it was, while something invisible had already begun shifting inside his home. The moment he pushed open the market door, the little brass bell above it chimed, and instantly the familiar gazes of the townspeople turned toward him. Not malicious, just too attentive, too curious, too ready to talk. In Snowfall Ridge, even the slightest change in the number of chickens at the Parker farm could turn into a week-long topic over coffee. So Eli Mercer, the gentle, widowed man people pitied more than they respected, bringing a stranger woman into his home was bound to set off a windstorm of gossip. Eli kept his expression steady as he walked to the aisle, but he hadn't even reached for the coffee bag when the whispering started right behind him. "That's the poor girl living at his house. Look at her clothes, so thin they barely hold the snow out. Who knows where she came running from?" Probably running from debt, or worse. Eli's too kind for his own good. Easy to take advantage of. Eli stayed still, his hand tightening around the coffee bag as if it were the only thing keeping him from turning around and saying something he would regret. He wasn't the type to interfere with harmless town chatter. He had ignored hundreds of rumors in his life. But this time, it sounded different. Because they were about Margaret. About the woman who had been in his house only a few days. The woman who had taught his daughter how to laugh again. The woman whose patched, humble clothes hid a dignity straighter than that of the people whispering. Another voice cut in, sharper, meaner. She's probably leeching off him for a free place to stay. What does she even bring to the Mercer household? A harsh laugh answered. She's nothing like Sarah. Sarah was far more elegant when she was alive. That struck Eli in the chest like a shard of ice. Not because they mentioned Sarah, but because they used Sarah as a ruler to belittle another woman. Sarah would never have done that, and Eli knew it. He turned, about to speak, when the phone of a woman nearby chimed. She glanced at the screen and smirked. Someone posted in the town Facebook group, says Eli brought home a strange girl, probably met her on the road or who knows. A girl like that definitely has secrets, someone added. Oh, don't worry, give it a few days. We'll know. They laughed, soft to even, but sharper than any blade. Eli walked away, heart pounding with a tightness that felt as though someone had pressed hard into his ribs. He left the store faster than planned, clutching the grocery bags as if they were weighted with something he couldn't name. On the drive home, the rumors echoed in his mind, repeating like a song with the wrong notes. Running from debt. Not good enough for Eli. Leeching off him. What does she bring? None of it was true, but every word struck something fragile inside him. And the more he tried to deny it, the more he recognized a truth he had not dared to consider. He was beginning to care for Margaret more than a man should for an employee. And that was why their words hurt. When Eli returned home, Margaret was hanging towels in the icy wind, her hands red from the cold, but her expression quietly peaceful. Hannah ran circles around her like a little sunbeam. Margaret turned and smiled when she saw Eli. You're back. He nodded but didn't return the smile. Not because he wanted to be cold, but because her smile reminded him of something he wasn't ready to face. The warmth seeping into his life without permission. Margaret paused for a moment. She didn't ask, didn't demand an explanation. She simply lowered her hands and continued her work. But that small pause was enough for cold air to slip between them. Inside, when Margaret stepped into the kitchen to wash the cups, Eli stood in the doorway, staring at the floor as though trying to rediscover himself beneath the morning's frost. She asked gently, "Did something happen in town?" "I'm tired," he answered too quickly. Margaret nodded, showing no visible reaction. No blame, no hurt displayed. But the very way she refused to let herself show pain made Eli's chest tighten. She was used to it, used to being judged, doubted, and examined with suspicion before she even opened her mouth. And he, in a moment of weakness, had let himself be swayed by others, bringing home a coldness he never wanted to bring. That night, the house grew so quiet the crackle of the fire sounded like a sigh. Hannah sat on the rug, playing with puzzle pieces, but her eyes kept flicking between Eli and Margaret, as if she could sense the tension the adults were trying and failing to hide. "Daddy?" Hannah called when Eli walked through the living room. "Why are you sad?" Eli stopped and looked at her. He wanted to say, "I'm fine," but the words stuck in his throat. Margaret was clearing the table. She heard, but pretended not to. Hannah slowly stood, walked over, and wrapped her arms around Eli's leg. "I like Miss Margaret." Her voice was small but steady. "She makes our house warmer. When she's here, I'm not scared of the dark anymore." Eli bent down to hold her, his hand trembling. Not because he didn't know how to respond, but because he knew his daughter always spoke the truth. A truth sharper than any rumor outside. He glanced toward Margaret for a second. She was wiping the table. Her movements were slow, steady, and, if he looked closely, slightly trembling. Eli stood still for a long time. In the sound of Hannah's breath pressed against his chest, in the small figure of Margaret, in the thin, fragile air that stretched across the room. Then he said something very small, barely audible even to himself. "Yeah," a single word. But it was the most he could admit, for now, as a man terrified of beginning again. And Hannah, with the pure heart of a child who understood her father's sadness better than he realized, only hugged him tighter. Somewhere in this house, warmth had started to grow again. But to acknowledge it, Eli still had a long road ahead. And Margaret, with all her quiet strength, did too. In the days that followed, Margaret's presence in the Mercer house felt like the way light slips through a forgotten gap in the curtains. At first thin and tentative, almost apologetic, but with time it spread, settled, softened the grayness Eli had learned to accept as an unchangeable fact of life after 2 years spent surviving loss. Hannah, small, tender, and far more perceptive than adults often remember a child's heart can be, adapted to Margaret's presence faster than anyone else. She trailed behind Margaret everywhere, into the kitchen, into the backyard, into the tiny reading room Eli had stopped calling a reading room the day Sarah left this world. What Eli didn't know how to face was the way Hannah laughed. Happily, naturally, without holding back, without fear of hurting anyone. And that laugh, beautiful and clear as it was, still hurt him because he remembered too well the long stretch of days when that sound had vanished entirely, when the world of father and daughter had been too cold, too emptied of warmth for joy to survive. That evening, darkness fell faster than usual. The wind knocked hard against the windows as if to remind them that winter was nowhere near finished, and snow began to fall again, thin white flakes descending quietly, carrying a sadness too soft to fight. Eli was rearranging a stack of papers in the kitchen when he heard Hannah's bright laughter echo down the hallway. "Miss Margaret, tell the princess story again. The part where she runs away. Hurry." Margaret laughed, her voice slightly raspy from a long day. All right, but you have to lie down first, or I won't continue." A small creak of the bed, the rustle of blankets, the sound of Hannah resting her head on someone's shoulder. Eli stepped out of the kitchen, intending to go to his daughter's room just to say goodnight. But the moment he got close, he stopped. Not intentionally listening, just something inside him stopped him, as if his body instinctively knew this moment didn't belong to him. Hannah's voice softened, delicate as a breath. "Miss Margaret?" "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret replied, her tone warm like a blanket pulled up to one's chin. "Will you—" Hannah hesitated, gathering whatever courage a child needs to face a pain so old it lives inside her sleep. "Will you leave me like Mama did?" Eli froze for a long, punishing second, long enough that he thought his heart had stopped. The words pierced the air like an arrow carrying the weight of hundreds of nights Hannah had cried quietly into her pillow, believing he didn't hear, carrying the childhood terror he had never known how to soothe. Inside the room, Margaret didn't answer right away. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. Then, Margaret pulled Hannah gently into her arms, her voice breaking but firm. No, Hannah, I'm not going anywhere. I'm right here." "Really?" A tiny sound, trembling, hopeful, terrified. "Really," Margaret said, and Eli heard every syllable like small stones being laid carefully onto the fragile heart of a child trying to heal 1 inch at a time. "I won't ever leave you, not anyone." Eli pressed his hand to the wall, his fingers whitening as they gripped the wooden panel. No one could see him. No one could hear the tight, strangled breath catching in his chest. But in that moment, he shook like a man standing in the center of a storm he no longer had the strength to withstand. Margaret's voice continued soft as a vow. "You don't have to worry. I'm here, Hannah. I'm here." Hannah sniffled. Margaret soothed her with slow, steady pats. Patient, rhythmic, like a borrowed heartbeat for a child whose own had been cracked too many times. And Eli, the man who thought he'd grown familiar with grief, familiar with the muffled cries his daughter hid in her pillow, familiar with the empty side of the bed that had been cold for 2 years, suddenly felt every wall he had built begin to split wide open. Not because Margaret said she would stay, not because Hannah clung to her like a lifeline, but because he realized he had been repeating the very trauma that had scarred his daughter the most. Silence. He had been silent with her for too long. Silent when she trembled. Silent instead of telling her she wasn't alone. Silent because he didn't know where to begin to heal what loss had torn open. Margaret was doing what he had never been brave enough to do. Eli stepped back from the doorway, his steps unsteady, as though someone had struck him hard in the chest. He walked to the garage, the place that held the remnants of his life, his woodworking tools, the car he'd once repaired with Sarah, the little chair he'd built for Hannah when she turned 4. He didn't turn on the light. Only the faint glow of the night seeped in through the frost-covered window. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old leather-bound journal, the one Sarah had written in during both her happiest and most painful days. The one he hadn't dared to open for 2 years because every page held her voice, and that voice had the power to crush him. Eli sat on the wooden stool. The tabletop was cold, and so were his hands. He opened the journal. The first page was Sarah's handwriting. Soft, careful, so beautiful it made his chest ache. He turned to the page marked with a red thread, a page he had never once dared to read. And the first line was, "Measure a person by their character, not their wealth." Eli shut his eyes tightly. It felt as if his entire heart fell onto the garage floor. Sarah had written that during their first year of marriage, back when he still felt insecure about earning less than she did, when he couldn't buy her the comforts others could. She had cupped his face in her hands, laughed, and told him, "People shouldn't be measured by their wallets, but by how they treat those with less." Eli didn't know when he began to cry. Not because of Sarah, not because of Hannah, but because he realized that lately, under the weight of rumors, whispers, and his own exhaustion, he had momentarily forgotten the very standard the woman he loved most had lived by. He had allowed others to define another woman's worth, instead of using his own eyes. Margaret was poor, but her character had never been, never torn, never shaken. He had seen it in the way she held Hannah, in the way she refused to react to insults, in the way she stood in the snow with her back straight. Eli lowered his face onto the journal, his shoulders shaking like a man who had finally allowed himself to fall apart after 2 years of holding everything together with bare hands. He didn't know how long he cried, only that when he finally lifted his head, the tears still warm on his cheeks, his heart, frozen for 2 years, for the first time since then, began to melt. That morning, Snowfall Ridge felt wrapped in a silence more delicate than mist. The first light of day barely cast a faint silver haze across the kitchen window, blending into the cold that rose from the floor. But inside that kitchen, where for the past 2 years, only the hollow clatter of dishes and the heavy quiet of a widower had existed, there were sounds that hadn't been heard since the day Sarah left this world. The thud of a pan on the stove, the soft drip of coffee into the pot, the gentle tap of a knife against the cutting board. Eli Mercer, the man who once neglected cooking, who had lived on boxed cereal and rushed dinners just to cover the emptiness, was making breakfast. He moved slowly, almost reverently, as if every slice of toast and every egg cracked into the bowl carried the apology he hadn't been able to say the night before. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, not from working but from sitting in the garage all night, carving until his hands throbbed with pain, shaping a small but perfectly formed wooden flower, the only apology he had enough courage to offer. On the kitchen table, beside 2 empty plates, the wooden flower lay still, its carvings rough but meticulous, like the record of a night spent wrestling with his own heart. As Eli set the table, soft footsteps sounded from the hallway. Margaret appeared, her hair slightly tousled, her fingers gripping her sleeve, a small habit Eli had learned to recognize, the gesture of someone bracing herself against a world that had never been gentle. Her eyes drifted over the kitchen, the smell of food, the warmth spreading faintly through the air, and finally to Eli himself. She paused at the doorway, unsure whether to step in or retreat. "Good morning," Eli said, his voice low and steady, though gentler than usual, a softness only people familiar with long-term grief could recognize. Margaret nodded lightly, her gaze cautious, a little cold, a little withdrawn, like someone so used to scrutiny she no longer believed she was truly welcome anywhere. "Do you need me to do anything?" she asked quietly. A simple question, yet on this morning it carried the tone of someone trying not to hope for anything more than necessity. Eli didn't answer right away. He wiped his hands on a dish towel, stepped toward the table, and carefully lifted the wooden flower. "Margaret," he said, soft, steady, as if guarding each word from shattering before it left his mouth. She looked up, her deep dark eyes unable to hide the exhaustion of many days. Exhaustion from travel, from worry, from the rumors already beginning to circle her, simply because she wasn't wealthy, wasn't refined, and didn't belong here. Eli placed the wooden flower on the table between her hands. "I owe you an apology." Margaret didn't move. Her hands didn't touch the flower, but her whole body stilled, as if the words struck a place she didn't want anyone to see. Eli drew in a breath and forced himself to continue. "The other day in town, I heard some rumors, some things that weren't true, some things that were cruel." He swallowed, "and I let it get to me." A heavy breath escaped him. "You are kind, Margaret, kind in a way most people never get to witness. But because I'm too used to loss, too used to fear, I doubted you. Not because you did anything wrong." He shook his head slowly. "Just because people said it." Margaret remained still, her lips pressed tight, as if holding back a tremor. Eli met her eyes directly, not turning away. "I'm sorry." A simple sentence. But from this man, it weighed more than the snow-covered mountain behind the house. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his voice lower, truer, "for letting other people make me question the character of someone who deserves far more respect." Margaret lowered her gaze to the wooden flower, her fingers trembling slightly as they touched it. The curves, the petals, the tiny knife marks carrying the faint scent of pine, every detail smoothed by the patience of a man who carried too many sleepless nights inside him. "You made this because of me?" Her voice was so soft it almost blended into the air. "Because I was wrong about you," Eli said without hesitation, "and because I know not everyone gets apologized to." That sentence pressed sharply into Margaret's chest, like someone squeezing her heart gently but firmly. She cupped the flower with both hands, holding it as if it were something beautiful and painful all at once, and her tears fell. Light and fast, as though she hadn't realized she'd been holding them in this whole time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Eli didn't move closer, didn't touch her, didn't reach out to wipe her tears. He stood there like a man who understood that true repentance didn't require an embrace, or promises, or grand gestures, only humility. Margaret wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "But—" She lifted her head, offering a small but sincere smile through the remnants of her trembling. "You don't owe me your trust. I understand that." Eli looked at her, steadily, for a long moment, as if memorizing the sight of her. The woman with tear-wet eyes still standing tall, holding a simple wooden flower, with a bruised heart that had never bowed to the cruelty of life. "Maybe not," Eli replied softly, "but I want to trust you." The kitchen fell quiet, not the heavy silence of previous days, but the silence of two people standing at the edge of something unnamed. Something both of them could feel, even if they didn't dare name it yet. Margaret tightened her hold on the flower. "Thank you for saying that." Eli nodded gently, his eyes never leaving hers. Margaret pulled out a chair and sat slowly, though her posture remained stiff, like a small bird that had nearly been trapped too many times and still didn't dare believe the offered hand was truly safe. Eli noticed, and he knew he would have to move slowly if he wanted to mend what he had cracked inside her. "I made breakfast," he said quietly. "I'm not sure if it's any good." Margaret let out a tiny warm laugh, even with the trace of tears still on her cheeks. "If it smells burned, She stopped, then corrected herself politely. "I'll pretend not to notice." Eli chuckled too, soft but real. And just like that, the morning that had begun with cold mist ended with something fragile but deeply warm. The remorse of a man who knew he had been wrong, and the cautious but sincere acceptance of a woman who had gone far too long without hearing an apology. A simple breakfast, a small wooden flower, a genuine apology. Sometimes it is these small things that become the very first place where a heart finds its way home. The days that followed moved with a strange rhythm Eli hadn't felt since the day Sarah died. A rhythm both familiar as breathing and distant enough that his heart tightened whenever he caught himself realizing the house had begun to change in ways he hadn't been alert enough to notice. In the mornings, when winter sunlight crept timidly through the frosted glass, Margaret was already sitting beside Hannah at the small kitchen table, her gentle hands guiding the little primer open, her voice soft enough that every syllable sounded as though she were relighting an old lamp inside the child's fragile heart. This letter, remember it, the sound is F. Family? That's right. Margaret smiled, and Hannah smiled back. Eli stood in the doorway, coffee cup still steaming in his hand, watching the two girls, one small, one quiet, sound out words together in the pale morning light. Neither of them noticed him standing there. And he liked that, liked watching them as if the world were finally operating on a gentle frequency he had thought he'd lost the right to feel. Then Hannah hopped off her chair and ran to fetch her box of crayons to make a birthday card for a classmate, and Margaret moved closer, guiding her through every tiny curve, every splash of color, every uneven line a child's hand could dream up. I want a rainbow, Hannah said. Which part should I help you with? Margaret asked. The hardest part. And Eli noticed something else. Margaret always let Hannah try first, make mistakes first, then stepped in only to guide, never to scold. No judgment. No pushing her to get it perfect. Only patience. So much patience it seemed she understood that the world needed people willing to place their hand behind a small heart, supporting it without weighing it down. That afternoon, when Eli headed to the backyard to check the storage shed he hadn't touched in ages, he found Margaret already there, sleeves rolled up, hair tied hastily, the rare bit of winter sun falling across her cheekbone, making her look like a patch of warmth slipped into a place long forgotten. What are you doing here? He asked, unable to hide his surprise. Margaret looked up and smiled. Not the kind of smile that tried to make herself smaller, but the kind that came from someone entirely at ease with her own presence. I noticed it was a little messy. Hannah said you'd been meaning to fix it up. Haven't had the time, he replied. I'm helping a bit, so it'll be easier for you. A simple sentence, but to Eli, who had handled every single thing alone for 2 years, it made him stand still for a moment, unsure what to say or even how to feel. He watched her sort the woodworking tools, organize screws and nails, fold the old cloths he once used for varnishing, and brush dust off the wooden table where he'd carved toys for his daughter. Her movements weren't hurried, not performative, just steady, careful, respectful, as though she honored even the inanimate objects that had belonged to the life of another before she stepped into it. And Eli, for the first time since Sarah's passing, he felt the shed breathe again. Not with the breath of the past, not with the breath of old pain, but with the breath of someone new, a new rhythm, a gentle warmth soothing the empty spaces he had learned to accept as untouchable. Later that afternoon, when the snowfall grew heavier and the wind turned sharp, the three of them returned inside. Hannah brought a book to the sofa and asked Margaret to read it aloud. Eli sat at a distance, holding a mug of coffee he didn't drink, watching the woman reading to his daughter as if she had been made for that very role. You used to teach for long? Eli asked when Margaret finally closed the book. She looked up, surprised that he initiated conversation, then answered in a low and steady, with a touch of pride, but even more of longing. 4 years. Elementary school. I've always loved children. Always loved story time. Reading circles. Kids see the world in a way that makes you want to be better. Eli listened, unblinking, as though each of her words pushed him closer to something larger than he wanted to admit. You miss it a lot, he said quietly. Margaret nodded. One day, I want to open a free reading corner for kids in town. Doesn't have to be big, just a few old shelves, a few books, a place where kids who can't afford books can still find a world of their own. Hannah immediately squealed, I'll go there. I'll sit in the sunny corner. Margaret laughed, her eyes sparkling with a kind of gentle hope she thought she'd lost somewhere between bus stops and nights spent waiting for the world to give her a chance again. Eli watched her for a long time. Not a poor woman, not someone seeking shelter, not someone who needed saving, but a woman with dreams, with conviction, with a resilience that felt almost breathtaking in its quietness. He saw her more clearly than ever, not because of her face, not because of her voice, Not because Hannah adored her, but because who she truly was had begun to surface, quietly, steadily, like a wildflower breaking through snow, unseen by the world, but impossible to ignore once you noticed it. By evening, Hannah had fallen asleep early after a day of reading and running. The house folded into the soft stillness of a winter night. Eli and Margaret cleaned up the living room together. No one spoke at first, not because of distance, but because there was a gentle, uncertain tenderness floating between them. Eli wiped the table. Margaret folded blankets. They stood only a few steps apart, but that small space felt full of unspoken things. Finally, Eli broke the silence, slowly, quietly, with a sincerity so raw, it made the entire room shift toward him. "Margaret, thank you." Margaret looked up, surprised. "For what?" she asked. Eli glanced around, at the house now a little less cold, at Hannah's desk neatly arranged again, at the small photo corner of Sarah put together so lovingly, at the shed now brighter, at the childish purple flower drawing left on the table, at the warmth she'd managed to sew into the places he was certain would remain ruins of an old life. "For making this house alive again." Margaret didn't move. Her eyes wavered, just slightly, as though his words were not something she was used to receiving, yet were the exact thing her heart had craved quietly for years. Eli looked at her for a long, still moment, looked at her the way a man begins to see something he had not allowed himself to see before. That she wasn't just someone who had come here to help. She was someone they, both father and daughter, were beginning to need. And when that realization settled in, something tender flickered inside him, a feeling he had tried to outrun. Affection, soft, tentative, afraid to come too close, but true. He turned slightly, trying to maintain distance, his voice slipping half a beat. "I don't know if it's too soon to say this, but I'm starting to see you differently." The words fell between them like an early spring breeze, not strong enough to push, but enough to make someone notice that the season was changing. Margaret took a small step back, not out of fear, but because she didn't know what to do with the emotion in his eyes, something she had never let herself believe could be meant for her. She whispered, "we should take things slowly, Eli." "Yeah," he murmured, "slowly." But even slowly, even gently, even without moving closer, yet a truth had already settled in the room. Eli no longer saw Margaret the way he had on the first day. He had begun to see the person she really was, enough for his heart to start stirring. And for a man who had lost his wife, who had been frozen for 2 long years, that was larger than anything he could name. That evening, a heavy mist settled over Snowfall Ridge, as if winter were exhaling its weight across the entire town. No snow fell, yet the stillness of the cold felt sharper than wind, as though the air itself held every sound hostage, leaving the small world around them sinking into a deep, echoing quiet. Hannah ran across the living room in the little bear-patterned socks Margaret had mended for her a few days earlier. She laughed so brightly that Eli, kneeling by the kitchen cabinet, fixing a loose hinge, found himself smiling without meaning to. Then in an instant, the laughter broke into a choking sob. Hannah slipped on the rug, her knee striking hard against the corner of the wooden table. "Ah!" A small cry, but enough to shatter the peaceful quiet into pieces. Eli dropped his tools and rushed toward her, his heart lurching as if old wounds had cracked open without warning. But Margaret reached her first. She knelt down immediately, her arms wrapping around Hannah with a calmness that didn't waver. No panic, no trembling, only the skill and warmth of someone who had soothed more hurting children than she could remember. "Hannah, look at me," she whispered, placing her hand gently on the girl's back, steady and soft. "Does it hurt a lot? Let me see it." Hannah hiccuped, tears spilling down her flushed cheeks. "It hurts so much." "I know," Margaret murmured, her voice as warm and soft as a cloth laid over a wound. "Let me check it, okay? Breathe slowly for me." Eli stood still, frozen like stone. His heartbeat crashed against his chest. He hated the sound of his daughter crying. It dug claws into memories he had sealed away. The night his wife lay in her hospital bed, the night he held Hannah. still too small to understand what loss meant. And the night he realized that the world could take away the person he loved most without warning. But while Eli stood paralyzed in the doorway of his own memories, Margaret had already taken care of everything. She examined the injury, cleaned it with warm water, blew gently to ease the sting, then wrapped it in a small strip of bandage. Her movements flowed like a familiar dance, so soft and sure that they made the room grow warmer by several degrees. Hannah wrapped her arms around Margaret's neck, still sniffling. "Don't leave, Miss Margaret. It hurts." "I'm right here," Margaret whispered, pressing her hand to the girl's cheek. "I'll always be here." Eli heard that, and something inside him tightened painfully. Not from hurt, but from a truth he had tried so hard to deny. She was the only person who could truly calm his child. Not him, not anyone in town, just her. When Hannah finally fell asleep on Margaret's shoulder, Eli silently lifted her and carried her to her room, laying her gently on the bed. Margaret stood by the doorway, watching him with eyes soft yet distant, as if she didn't dare step even an inch further into a space she believed did not belong to her. When Eli closed Hannah's door, the world narrowed to the dim hallway where the two of them stood facing each other, close enough to hear each other's breaths. Margaret tugged lightly at her sleeve. "Sorry, I didn't mean to take over caring for her." Eli shook his head, stepping closer. "Just a little." "No, you did better than I did. You always do." Margaret lowered her gaze, her voice hushed, a mix of embarrassment and hesitation. I don't want her to feel alone while she's hurting. I used to." She stopped, drawing a long breath. "I used to know what that felt like." Eli tilted his head. "What feeling?" She braced her hand against the doorframe, as though the weight of memory had pressed hard against her chest. "The night my father died," she said, her voice breaking slowly. "I was alone in the hospital. Everyone had gone home. No one warned me. No one stayed after I stood there for a long time, feeling like the rest of the world was still moving, and I was the only one standing still, left behind." The warm lamplight touched her face, illuminating eyes that were beautiful and broken and lonelier than Eli could bear to look at too closely. Because he feared if he breathed too loudly, he might break the last bit of courage she was holding together. "I hate feeling alone in moments like that," she said softly. "So I didn't want Hannah to feel that way. Even once." Eli didn't know when he began moving toward her. Maybe it was when she said alone. Maybe when she said hospital. Maybe when she tried to steady her voice to hide the kind of grief only those who've lost someone truly know. "Margaret," he murmured. The sound of her name made her lift her gaze, eyes shimmering like water. He hesitated for a heartbeat. The most important heartbeat, then spoke. "I've stood alone too. The night Sarah died. I didn't know what to say, do, or be strong. I just stood there, watching the person I love most slip away, and I could do nothing." Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, as if her heart ached on his behalf. "Eli, you know the worst part?" he asked, voice cracking. "I didn't dare say stay, because I knew no one could. Not for me." Margaret, guided by instinct, the instinct of a former teacher, of someone who'd known grief, of someone who had rebuilt her heart piece by fragile piece, slowly lifted her hand and placed it over Eli's clenched one. A soft touch, but enough to make 2 years of his solitude tremble. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered. Eli looked down at their hands. Even the slightest touch made his entire heart ripple, like a lake stirred by the gentlest possible breeze. It was the first time they had spoken honestly. So honest, so slow, so close that it felt as though they were standing on a snow-covered bridge, one wrong step away from falling into old pain, yet still choosing to move forward. Neither of them spoke. Margaret looked up. Eli leaned down. The moment between them pulled tight like an embroidery thread, beautiful enough to make the whole world hold its breath. Only their eyes, their breaths, and the quiet trembling between a man afraid to begin and a woman afraid to be left behind. Their lips were only centimeters apart when Eli froze. 1 second, then a breath, and he stepped back. Not far, just enough to break the most beautiful moment of the winter. Margaret stayed still. Her lashes fluttered, not in anger, not in hurt, but in understanding. He wasn't ready. She bit her lip, stepped back, and quietly gave him the space he needed. "Good night," she whispered. Eli answered in a low, trembling voice. "Good night, Margaret." Hannah's door remained slightly ajar, the soft sound of her breathing like the quiet heartbeat of innocence. In the wooden house, two adults stood only a small distance apart, yet separated by 2 years of grief and wounds. Neither of them had fully learned to set down. But that evening, something shifted, even if only slightly. Eli's heart had begun learning to trust again, and Margaret's heart had begun learning not to run anymore. Sunday mornings in Snowfall Ridge always carried a particular kind of peace. The church bells drifting across the cold sky, winter breath fogging the car windows, and the faint scent of burning pine wood lingering in everyone's clothes like a familiar memory of the small town they all belonged to. Eli led Hannah down the front steps, still wrapped in the thick black coat that had been with him through 2 winters, while Margaret walked behind them, wearing a worn cream-colored sweater that hugged her slender frame, her long hair tucked to one side, forming an image of a woman both gentle and quietly steadfast in a way that made Eli's heart constrict with feelings he still didn't dare to name. They got into the truck and drove toward First Ridge Chapel, a small place, but large enough to contain every rumor, every stare, and every whisper the town had reserved for them. When Eli parked and stepped out, he felt the weight of the eyes instantly, cold, sharp, cutting through the layers of his coat. Margaret paused a single second, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag, not from fear, but from the effort of preparing herself to face what waited inside. She didn't hide. She didn't lower her head. But the faint tension around her mouth revealed a truth Eli noticed immediately. She was alone in her attempt to appear unbothered. He opened the door for Hannah, then reached his hand toward Margaret. Such a small gesture that she blinked, startled. She placed her hand in his. Her fingers were as cold as snow, but the steadiness in her eyes was warm enough to make Eli swallow hard. They walked into the church. The silence was instantaneous, every whisper, every unfinished remark froze in place. Margaret stood tall, eyes fixed on the altar ahead, as though refusing to let the judgment slicing across her skin push her back. A group of women near the front pew leaned toward one another, making no effort to hide their words. Eli recognized the sharp nasal voice of Mrs. Carson, the self-appointed guardian of the town's decency. Coming to church dressed like that? Truly no shame. Eli Mercer must have lost his mind bringing someone like her here. I heard she's practically freeloading at his house. A mocking laugh. Margaret went still. Eli saw her back tremble, barely, but enough to expose a wound someone had just pressed a finger against. Hannah tugged Margaret's hand. "Miss Margaret, they're saying mean things about you, aren't they?" Margaret bent down, forcing a small, shaky smile. "It's all right, sweetheart. I'm used to it." Used to it. Those 2 words pierced Eli's chest like an icy blade. A woman this kind, this gentle, this good, had grown used to being hurt? Number. Not anymore. Mrs. Carson began strutting toward Margaret, chin lifted in superiority, but Eli stepped forward, suddenly and decisively, placing himself between them. The movement was sharp enough that several people flinched. Mrs. Carson blinked, then adopted a patronizing tone. "Oh, Eli, you really should listen to me. This woman—" "That's enough." His voice wasn't loud, but it cracked through the church like stone splitting under frost. Silence swept through the room. Eli turned fully toward Margaret. Then, in full view of the entire town, he took her hand. Not to pull her, not to shield her out of reflex, but to make a statement. Then he faced everyone. "She came into my life with nothing but honesty," he said, each word landing with the weight of truth. No one spoke. Margaret's heartbeat seemed to pulse in the air itself. "And she is worth more than anyone here has the courage to admit." 1 second, 2, 3. The church held its breath. Margaret stood so still that Eli could feel the tremor in her hand. She looked at him as if she couldn't believe those words belonged to her, as if no one had ever stood for her so openly in her entire life. Mrs. Carson's mouth hung open, her face reddening like a struck apple. "Eli Mercer, you don't even know where she came from. She's dirt poor." Being poor isn't a crime. Eli's voice cut clean through hers, so sharp she went pale. He squeezed Margaret's hand, just enough to tell her she wasn't alone in this moment. Not in front of this crowd, not against this ugly little storm. A man in the back spoke. He's right. She's kinder than half this room. Another voice followed. I've seen how she cares for Hannah. She's good. A woman added, I met her last week. Polite, lovely girl. Someone else stepped out of a pew, nodding at Margaret. I'm sorry I believed the rumors. The air, heavy as a stone pressing on everyone's chest, began to shift, melting slowly but undeniably. Then, like dominoes, the decent souls in town stepped forward, soft words falling like early sunlight on a frozen morning. We support you, Miss Margaret. No one deserves to be treated like that. We see your worth. Margaret's throat tightened. Her eyes glistened, not with joy, but with the kind of disbelief that comes from being defended, finally as a human being, and not as a target for gossip. Eli turned to her, and for a moment the world shrank to just the two of them, even though the entire town stood around them. Margaret's voice trembled as she whispered, Did you do that for Hannah or for me? A soft question, but one that sliced straight into the wound Eli kept deepest. He looked at her, his lips parted, then closed again. He couldn't answer. He couldn't lie either, because the truth was too clear. He hadn't done it for Hannah. He'd done it for her, because he cared, because he feared for her, because he couldn't bear watching her hurt, because, without noticing when or how, he had begun to love her, because the feeling inside him was too big, too overwhelming, too real, and it had lodged itself in his chest so tightly he could barely breathe. Margaret saw the truth in his eyes. She looked down, not out of shame, but because her own heart trembled like a small leaf caught in a powerful wind, afraid to hope too soon, afraid to want something she had never believed she deserved. Eli tightened his grip on her hand, his silence serving as his first confession. And that Sunday morning, inside a small-town chapel, with whispers still hanging in the air, with curious eyes still watching, with the church bells echoing long enough to stretch every breath, a widowed man stepped out of his fear. A poor woman was finally seen for her worth, and an unnamed love, growing in silence, took its first unmistakable shape. That night, the winter wind had grown weaker, no longer carrying a skin-cutting chill, but drifting in soft, wavering currents. As if winter itself had grown tired and wanted to loosen its own harsh grip. The snow on the small porch roof melted into shimmering drops that fell one by one onto the wooden steps below. Eli stepped into the house after all the lights had been turned off, except for the dim hallway lamp outside Hannah's room, casting a soft golden glow like the quiet breath of a sleeping child. He stood in the living room, his hands still numb from the cold, but his chest burning. Not from anger, not from confusion anymore, but from something clearer than anything he had admitted to himself until now. So clear it nearly knocked him off balance. He had chosen Margaret long before he realized the decision had already taken root inside him. The image of her standing in church that morning, calmly enduring the cutting stares without ever lowering her voice to beg for pity. The image of her holding Hannah's hand, protecting the child with tenderness so pure it felt like early spring sunlight. The image of her turning to him, her voice trembling as she asked, Did you do that for Hannah or for me? That question, from the moment he left the church until he stood beneath this porch, had clung to him like an answer waiting to be spoken aloud. Eli couldn't sleep. He couldn't. He pulled on his jacket and walked down to the garage, where the scent of pine wood, oil, and the memories he hadn't dared to touch for 2 years lingered. The old wooden work table, still scratched from the toys he used to make for Hannah, sat beneath the dim yellow lamp. In the corner lay a small piece of unfinished pine he had started carving weeks ago, waiting as if it knew he would return. Eli sat, his rough hands trembling slightly from the cold, and from the truth rising inside him, he missed the feeling of making something for someone he cared about. It had been so long, too long. The carving knife slid along the grain, slow strokes, soft strokes, as if each line he carved into the wood released the feeling he had kept trapped in his chest for 2 years. A petal emerged, then a tiny leaf, then the curved stem he had once been afraid to complete. For the first time since Sarah died, he was making something not out of responsibility, but out of love. Not love in its fiery, reckless form, but the kind that grows quietly. The way the soil thawed in his backyard each spring, not loud, not hurried, just steady, warm, certain. When he finished, Eli placed the wooden flower in his palm, simple, unpolished, yet so honest it made his eyes sting. Just like Margaret. Simple, true, precious in a way the world was often too blind to see. He stayed in the garage until dawn, until the first morning light seeped through the small window, washing the room in the pale, pure glow of late winter. The next morning, Margaret stepped out of her room to the familiar creak of the wooden floorboards. She still wore her old sweater, her hair loosely tied, her posture tilting slightly from exhaustion, yet her eyes remained clear, dignified, just as they had been the first night she arrived in this house. She expected nothing, dared hope for nothing, refused to allow herself to want anything from him, just another ordinary morning, or so she thought. But as she walked past the kitchen, she stopped abruptly. On the dining table was the most complete breakfast she had ever seen in this house. Perfectly fried eggs with soft yolks, golden pancakes, crispy bacon, fresh berries washed and placed in the ceramic bowl she once complimented for its pretty pattern. And at the center of the table, a wooden flower beside a small ring box. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, her heartbeat crashing so violently she had to take a step back to steady herself. Eli stood near the stove, his hands dusted with pancake batter, his hair slightly messy, his eyes hesitant, but lit with something she didn't dare name. "Eli, what is this?" Margaret whispered, her voice so soft it nearly dissolved in the air. He set the pan down, wiped his hands on a dish towel, and walked toward her. Not too fast, not too slow, just enough to make her heart clench with every step. "Margaret," he began, his voice tight with emotion. He swallowed hard, standing in front of her, his fingers laced together as if holding himself steady. "Last night, I thought for a long time." He looked into her eyes, fully, directly, without running from anything anymore. "I've let fear lead me for too long. I let rumors, the pressure of the town, old memories, blind me to what was right in front of me." Margaret didn't move. Tears were already gathering in her eyes. Eli opened the ring box, revealing a small ring. Not extravagant, not glittering, just simple and beautiful in a way that made her heart tremble. He placed the wooden flower in her hand first. "This, I made it because I was thinking of you, because I wanted you to know that someone here sees you." A quiet gasp escaped her. She had been judged, misunderstood, and wounded her entire life, but rarely truly seen. Not like this. Eli took a deep breath and spoke, his voice low and steady, as if each word were pulled from the deepest part of him. "I choose you." Margaret broke into tears immediately, but he continued. "Not because I need someone to help, or because Hannah needs a woman in the house." He stepped closer, his hands trembling, but his eyes unmistakably certain. "I choose you because you deserve to be loved, because you are the kindest person I have ever met, and because you make this house a home." She raised both hands to her mouth, tears spilling onto his skin, warm enough to melt the last layer of ice around his heart. "Eli, I—" He lifted a hand to her cheek, barely touching, as if afraid she would break. "If you'll let me, I want us to begin. Not because of loss, not because of loneliness, but because I truly—" His voice caught before he could say love. But Margaret already understood. She always understood. She threw her arms around him without hesitation, without restraint, as if her whole life had been waiting for the moment someone finally saw her completely. She cried into his chest, her sobs trembling but so achingly beautiful that Eli held her as though afraid she might disappear into thin air. "No one has ever chosen me in their whole life," she whispered between tears. "Never, until today." Eli held her tighter. "I choose you. Now, and every day after this." Outside the window, the late winter sun touched the snowy ground, melting the thin layer of frost into clear, shimmering droplets. Just like that morning, when winter began yielding to spring. And in the small wooden house where grief once lived, the winter inside two worn hearts finally began to melt. That morning unfolded with the kind of light Snowfall Ridge only had for a few weeks each year. A pale gold, soft as velvet, warm enough to melt the frost on the window panes into tiny shimmering droplets, yet still cool enough to remind everyone that winter hadn't quite left. It was only slowly making way. Margaret hadn't fully absorbed the warmth of Eli's arms around her when from the end of the hallway the quick patter of footsteps echoed toward them, fast and urgent, like a small bird racing back to its nest. The bedroom door flew open. "Daddy, Miss Margaret!" Hannah barreled into them like a little gust of wind, carrying the scent of peppermint candy and the lavender-scented shampoo Margaret had used on her the night before. She wrapped both of them in one tight hug, her small arms squeezing as if she were afraid they would vanish if she let go for even a second. "Is it true you're going to be my new mom?" The question burst out between choppy breaths, trembling, full of hope, full of fear, full of a longing so big her tiny heart didn't know where to put it. Margaret dropped to her knees and pulled her close. She slid a hand through Hannah's hair, pressing a soft kiss to the crown that still smelled like childhood, and answered in a whisper, threaded with a love too deep to easily describe. "If you want—" She paused for a heartbeat. "If you really want that, then yes, I'll be your mom." Hannah cried first, then Margaret, and finally Eli, not with loud sobs, but by standing there with his hand over his mouth for a moment, looking as though someone had just handed his heart back to him after 2 empty, frozen years. The scene was so simple it didn't need music or grand speeches, just the undeniable truth that a family had just been born in the circle of their arms. The day moved slowly, like a spring poem. By noon, the sun had climbed high enough to gently wake the front yard, where the snow had thinned into something like a white veil. Hannah ran back and forth, gathering twigs, proudly declaring herself the official flower keeper, in a tone that made both adults smile. Margaret stood on the front steps, arms folded loosely across her chest, watching the child her heart had loved from the very first moment, watching her with all the tenderness she once thought she'd lost the ability to feel after everything life had taken. Eli stepped up beside her and handed her a mug of hot coffee. "It's going to be cold tonight, but it'll start getting warmer soon," he said, as if making casual conversation. But Margaret heard something else inside those words. Winter is almost over. So are we. She hadn't yet found an answer when Hannah suddenly shouted, "Daddy, Miss Margaret, come here, quick!" Her voice was so full of wonder that they both rushed down into the yard. Eli stopped short, a slow smile spreading across his face. At Hannah's feet, in the patch of melting snow, tiny crocuses were pushing through the earth, soft purple, gentle yellow, and white like early morning light. Sarah's favorite flowers, the ones she had planted every year by the porch, the flowers of quiet hope, and now they had bloomed again. Margaret knelt beside Hannah, her fingertips brushing one delicate petal, as if touching a fragment of an old memory someone had carefully returned. "These are crocuses," Hannah said with adorably serious authority. My old mom planted them. I remember her saying so." Margaret swallowed hard. The grief wasn't hers, but she felt it and honored it with a deep, quiet love. Eli lowered himself beside them, one hand resting on Hannah's back and the other on Margaret's shoulder. Not claiming, not controlling, simply present, solid, steady, like a man who had finally decided he was ready to move forward. "You know," he said, his voice low like a spring breeze brushing the hem of a coat, "every year Sarah planted them to remind me that winter never stays forever, that every heart has to thaw sometime." Margaret looked up. Her eyes shimmered under the sunlight, not with sorrow but with emotion. Eli drew in a long breath deep enough to let go of all the old pain, strong enough to rise with the new hope. He held out his hand, a small gesture, carrying a promise big enough to reshape a life. "Margaret," he said softly, "welcome home." She placed her hand in his, the same hand that had once trembled from fear, once gone cold from loneliness, once hung empty with nowhere to belong. And for the first time in her adult life, she could answer without shaking, "I'm home, really home." Hannah wrapped her arms around both of them from behind, sniffling with excitement. "We're just like the crocuses," she declared. "Covered in snow but still growing back." Eli laughed. Margaret laughed with him, their smiles as light as the first breath of spring. Yeah. The three of them walked back into the house where sunlight streamed through every gap in the curtains, where warmth spread from the kitchen, where morning laughter wove itself through the rooms like a ribbon tying once broken hearts together. The house was no longer cold, no longer silent, no longer defined by the empty spaces shaped like long winters and old pain. It had become a home, finally and for good.